Hi, I'm Diane Neubauer,
And I'm Reed Riggs.
and this is Conversations about Language Teaching. Today we are going to be talking about teaching culture and the issue of culture in language learning and language classes. Should I go ahead and launch into a first thought, Reed?
Yeah, go for it. So Diane, you lead
Okay.
this episode.
Okay. I think often we just take for granted a definition. So let's start there. And I think culture is extremely difficult to define. I'm going to start out by saying what I don't think it merely is. It is not just the products. It is not just the thing that I always run to with having a Chinese language teaching background is it is not about Chinese opera masks. Like that's not what culture is entirely. That's a small, thin sliver that's a very pretty, beautiful product that relates to some practices that can teach us about some perspectives that people have. But I think too often we think culture is this add-on piece that's so much around products or maybe a practice. And so I want to think deeper and wider than that. Think of culture as like a way that people generally agree is a way to live.
Hmm.
Like
Sure. Yeah.
it's it's not just a single person, but some sort of a community around them, and they sort of have a general consensus about these are the things that are important to us in the way that we're going to carry out life.
Okay, so I want to add to that
Mhm.
because um, I get a sense oftentimes when we talk about when we use when teachers and teacher educators, teacher trainers, people related connected to language teaching and language teacher education, when we talk about culture, a lot of times we bring up things that I sense that people from that community, from that country, um, would not say, "Oh, that's our culture." And
Yeah,
so when we say, "Oh, look, in China, more and more people are moving to the cities, and this is a trend going on in society," so that's the cultural piece. I struggle to call that culture because I don't think a lot of Chinese people would say our culture is moving to cities.
right,
And so what I like
right.
to do is separate the two and say, we're going to learn a lot about society. And so to
Mhm.
me, when we say, oh, make sure you teach about culture, what are people in that country doing? I like to make a little separation between saying, let's learn a lot about what people in the country are doing. Let's learn about changes. Let's learn about what's going well, what's not going well, people that are struggling. And I wouldn't lump that, I don't feel comfortable calling all of that culture. So a lot of
Mhm.
times I say, okay, we're going to learn about society and it checks the culture box. Like as a teacher, I have to
Yeah.
teach culture. Okay, it checks that box that we call culture. But yeah, I want to teach it, but I don't like calling it culture. I call it society instead.
Yeah, okay, that I can work with that. Things that I've read, and I'm thinking of, I didn't just look it up, but who I was thinking of leaning on when I was saying that, kind of about the way of living, sort of
Yeah.
how do people carry out their living.
Well, you said
Um,
want to, like how do they want to live? Right.
oh, well, yeah, but
Okay.
how do they actually do it too?
Okay. Okay.
Is Claire Cramsch. So that's Kramschch, who I was introduced to in grad school. She talks a lot about culture and thinking in a deep way about this is definitely not an easily parsed thing. It's not a stable thing. It's not a thing where, oh, a white American woman from a certain age category. So therefore my culture is X and that's it. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, no, I lived in
Yeah.
China 4 years and I really see myself as bicultural in a lot of ways from that experience. And I'm influenced by other people and other places I've lived. And like, we're not just this uniform, neatly definable thing. The other thing that I really liked from Cramsch's work on this kind of topic is the idea of a third culture. So when you're moving cross-culturally, to just throw that word back in there,
Mm-hmm.
um, from one group or society you lived in, and the values and the ways that you had of doing things, um, the foods you ate, the how early you got up, when you worked and how and where, all those kinds of pieces of life. Like when you shifted to some other society, you're developing, not really moving from the one culture into the other culture, but you're developing a third culture. And you're in a third space where you're kind of being able to move and look at both, where did I come from and what have I been like, and then what are the people that are around me now, and kind of not necessarily choosing in a conscious way, but being influenced and making some choices about how you're going to adapt to both.
Right.
So you're not stable. So I really like that concept because I think I've experienced it deeply. And I think it's a better model for intercultural learning than what I sometimes see. Going back to that Chinese opera mask thing, I'm going to throw Chinese language teachers under the bus, proverbially here. The other thing that I think I sometimes see, and I see it more, I think, in Chinese language classrooms, is that there's this body of culture, and we need to inculcate it into our students. Like we have this rich culture, yes, we do, but we aren't there to replace the student's background, their culture. We're there to introduce them to a new one so that they have that third space experience, that they're interculturally informed. They can start to re-examine their own background and the new things that they're learning, and not holding space for not judging, but being able to think critically.
Yeah.
I think that all of those are really important. And so we're not importing and dumping a set of culture, products, practices, beliefs on our students. We're introducing them to things, hopefully experientially, not by, telling them in sentences, this is that, and now we do this. And does everybody do that? Really?
Right.
How do they carry it out? Like I lived in Southwest China, and people from the north talk about things that are Chinese culture. I didn't experience them. We did not eat jiaozi at midnight in Kunming. I mean, I didn't, and nor did my close friends. But I'm told that that's Chinese culture. It is for some,
Yeah.
So it's something I knew about. But yeah, so like the hand motion I'm doing on camera here is like this kind of growing, changing, organic, moving thing. There's a substance to it, but it's hard to pin down.
Yeah. Yeah. I for me as a teacher, I try to keep in mind, what are my goals? I'm always thinking, what are my goals? And I'm always sort of reinventing or rechecking. I sort of do an inventory of my goals constantly and think, okay, what are my goals in a very fluid sense? Like check again, make sure I sort of refresh my goals for my students. And when it comes to culture, I'm always having in mind, okay, we're learning to use language. Like we're learning to use language, and using language means having fruitful, productive conversations with people, or listening to people, whether in real time or in some sort of, watching videos or reading things that have been written by people in that language, and being able to stay engaged with it. And to stay engaged with it means that you don't, the example I give, I had students choose foods that they would order at a restaurant. It was a whole class discussion we were doing about 2 years ago. And one of my students said, okay, I'm going to order the jidra, or feng dra, I think it was. And I said, okay, all right, feng dra. And he goes, wait, that's real? And I said, yeah, everyone, what is that? And they said, chicken feet. And I think one student, everyone got silent, but one student went, ew. And I just stopped the class.
Reaction,
It is a classic reaction. And I stopped the class and I said, and I thought this up on the spot, and it's still kind of my mantra, sort of. I said, you don't have to like the idea of it, and you don't even have to try it, but you just don't say ew. Like I need you to learn how to interact with people. Yeah. Like there's certain things you need to hold inside so that you can continue to have a conversation with someone, so that you can continue to stay open to hearing them out, and really, and to look at their context. So one of those same students, we took him on an impact term trip to different Chinese restaurants, and he and his whole table ate the chicken feet, and they were proud of it. This is about a year later. But I was like, cool, I wasn't expecting that, but look, you stayed engaged and you tried some new food. So,
I have, I'll admit, I have had to watch that one from a distance. I can't do that one, but
totally fine. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, the foods that we eat are a classic one for reactions like that. And so guiding students to like, yeah, we're not saying that you must adopt everything, that you must like everything, but that you need to listen and observe and see how this maybe fits into a bigger picture. What does it mean to those folks? Respect that, even if you don't maybe respect an exact practice.
Right.
Like understand where that's coming from and how that does something
Yeah,
within that group of
sure.
people that adhere to that. So,
I have a heavier one that me as a third culture person, I lived in China for 7 years. It definitely, had impacts on me. And one that comes up is when people say, you should never in America, I hear like you should never ever hit your kids. And I personally agree. I personally agree for my kid and for people who don't want to hit their kids. Um, I saw it a lot in China
mhm.
and I saw a context around it. And it's something where I say that
Yeah, I
I'm
didn't
not gonna
see
judge.
abusive hit. Like I
No,
didn't hear
no,
see, injury hit.
no. It
But
was
yeah,
scolding and
more
yelling, a lot
physical.
of scolding
Yeah.
and yelling. And it got me thinking like I got to put my thoughts on different shelves in different jars and sort of
Mm,
compartmentalize a bit and just say there's a context in which that happens. And I'm not going to sit around and say that that shouldn't happen. I just remove myself,
mhm.
remove myself from it.
Yeah, I mean that's one technique. I mean, I think it's okay to say something's wrong, but I
Sure.
believe there are some things that are still absolutes.
Okay. Yeah.
But I would hold back on how fast do we get there.
Hmm.
And so yeah, I think that's yeah.
But and also
So
the third culture thing is it's always going to be unique to the individual person. And I never
mhm,
meet someone who had my same, living in China experience. No, I've never met a person who's exactly like me,
right,
impacted in the
right.
exact same way. So we
And
end up, yeah,
that's why it's this like fuzzy kind of
yeah,
like, yeah, you can kind of say like, yeah, I've adopted in some ways some Chinese cultural things that I experienced because I lived there so long.
yeah.
And you're from Southern California, but now you live in Hawaii. I bet you have I've seen your family do things that feel Hawaiian to me.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it's fun. It's like that's a natural way that people do things, but it's
Yeah.
this growing and changing thing for the individual that's in the
Mm.
society and the society
Yeah.
as a whole. It'll
Yeah.
grow and change.
Yeah. So I don't know if you're familiar with this research on intercultural development in students where they journal a lot and through
Yeah,
journaling.
a bit. Yeah. Yeah. I haven't done the journaling piece before,
Yeah.
but I have heard of that as a thing.
Yeah. What I was
Yeah.
reading is that like there are these different sort of models in research about how students go from a very what do they call ethnocentric or sort of called self-centric kind of way of thinking.
Hmm.
And then they go through like a stage that's still within stage one where they think, now my culture is completely wrong and the other culture is universally
Yeah.
correct. It's like,
The
oh, French
honeymoon
culture,
phase.
honey, yeah,
Hmm.
French culture is exactly the right way everyone should do things. My culture
Yeah.
was wrong my whole life. I just realized that. But then there's later stages where you truly open up and say, oh,
Right.
everything is based in a context.
Yeah.
Everything. And again, you're not,
Ethno-relativism.
it's relativism. Yeah,
There,
ethno-relativism. And so,
yeah, ethno-relativism.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, this culture is this thing that I think is really great, and this
Hmm.
one has this other thing that I think
Yeah.
is great, and then but my home culture does this thing, and we push so hard about working so hard that
Mm.
we don't have that thing that the Italians do, where they have a month off every August, as much as like there
You
are
can see
consequences. There's
you
my
can
point.
see everything. Yeah,
There
yeah,
are consequences to cultural choices or the ways that we do things. They may not all be moral,
yeah,
but they do have consequences, and you might prefer one or another consequence.
yeah. Well, and
But
also
yeah,
to
there is
not
morality to
necessarily
it.
and to not necessarily have a preference either, to be able to sit back and say,
Yeah,
oh yeah, oh people here do that. They do it because of this. Their perspective might be XYZ. Now I know about that. And I guess you could have an opinion like, oh, neat. Like it doesn't have to be a strong opinion. Like, oh yeah,
right.
that's kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah. I feel that way about bento boxes.
Oh
Like
yeah, neat.
Japanese food, like, oh, that's so cute.
Yeah.
Oh, I like a little experience of that every now and then, but
Mhm.
I haven't adopted that kind of way of organizing my food in general.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, I guess
yeah.
we've been talking
So
about products, practices, perspectives. Do you want to mention where that comes from?
yes, that's a great point, and maybe we can mention some models of intercultural development too. Actful, of course, the the no longer an acronym, Organization for Language Teachers in the United States, language educators as a whole, really. So that they're thinking of culture in three areas. And so it's a kind of a neat, compactable, unpackable kind of set of concepts. So oh, am I really teaching everything about culture? Well, not if you're only mentioning a few products. That's very limited lens on what that means. But so objects, things that people use, you can see, touch, practices, things people do, like dances, religious habits.
Seeing family on specific calendar days.
Yes, greeting formats. Did you kiss on the cheek? How many cheeks? Those sorts of things in parts of Europe and other
Yeah.
places probably too.
Mhm.
And then there's perspectives. So what is it about like do people really value family, for example, nuclear family or extended family? What is those kinds of beliefs, and those will drive practices and create products. And so there's a relationship. So the idea Actful has is that we want to see the relationship between these two, why a product relates to a perspective, why practices relate to a perspective. And we can do this, I argue, with novice students by exposing them, as you mentioned already, to examples from actual target language communities. So they watch a little video clip, they see photographs and they make some comparisons. They read a story by someone from that target language community in their voice. So their voice and their representation is important in understanding people, not just taking outsiders' views in, but views up and out from the cultural group. And then I think I got that with the Actful thing. Does that sound like everything?
It does, yeah.
Oh, and
Yeah.
then there's now some intercultural learning standards that Actful is introducing so that you can kind of think about what's an appropriate thing for a novice learner. So as they're getting novice language ability, can you be introducing intercultural learning as well? So
Yeah.
like I can identify a product that's,
Yeah.
unique to this target language community or something like that.
Yeah.
And then they starting to draw more and more depth of understanding
Yeah.
over time.
I've found in my own experience, uh, living in China, I was always kind of drawn to people that were sort of counter to everyone around them. Like when I was in Sichuan, it was normal that the majority of people in the restaurants and families wanted something spicy among their dishes at any meal. They don't want all
Yeah,
the dishes to be
Yunnan too.
spicy. Yeah, it's like we have to
Yeah,
have a
Yunnan is the
balanced
province I was
table.
in.
Yeah, and I was in Sichuan for most of my time. And yeah, in Southwest China, there's it's typical to want something spicy. Usually you want a balance. So you'll have a light soup, you'll have a spicy dish, you'll have something that's maybe heavy in flavor balanced with like a green vegetable that's light. And you kind of pick around the table as different things. And so you don't want everything to be spicy, but you want something that's going to be spicy. But well, so that in itself is already like one example of what I want to get at is like embedding diversity into teaching
Mhm.
perspectives and
Yeah,
practices and products. Like you don't want
yeah,
to come away saying, so what do Chinese people think about this? Like what's the Chinese
yeah.
people's perspective? It's you're really teaching the wrong
Yes,
thing if it's like they all think one thing.
right.
So what I loved was when I would meet someone who'd say, "Oh yeah, I don't eat spicy food. I can't handle any spicy food." And I was like, "What?
Yeah, in
Where'd you grow up?"
Sichuan.
And like, "Yeah, I
Yeah.
grew up here. No, my parents are from here. I just personally didn't like it." And so I would think on that and say, "Oh, that's the person I want to focus on in a lesson.
Uh-huh.
It's the odd one out because it naturally brings with it a perspective on diversity, but also you get to kind of dig in and say like, well, why?
Yeah.
And that person
That
just chose from childhood not to. And you say, oh, humans can be different simply
had
because of
different things.
choices. Yeah.
Yes.
Like as simple as
Yeah.
that. Yeah. So yeah, the Sichuan person who doesn't like spicy food. And I know that can also sound like it's promoting stereotypes, but that's a big what's the normal metaphor for this thing in the road? I can't think of a metaphor.
The
It's
elephant in
some
the room. No,
something to
that's
be careful about on the road up ahead. The iceberg in front of the ship. I'm not sure. Is that teaching culture often can easily turn into stereotypes.
Yes.
And you want
Right.
to,
Especially when it's delivered as this is, here's a sentence summary and this is it, because students
yeah,
don't have a lot of experiences, and that's really the better way to get it. And so
yeah,
that's why that all those little pieces, letting them start to experience, oh, so you noticed that the people in that video did this.
yeah.
Okay.
And my students will say
Okay,
things
let's
like, "Oh, wait, yeah,
keep that in mind and keep looking,
yeah." And my students will say things like, "Wait, I thought Chinese people, blah, blah, blah." And I'll say, "Oh, no, good catch. And look at what they're doing here. This is different from whatever you learned before." It's like
Yeah,
different people are doing different things all the time. And
right.
it makes it hard to like, quote unquote, teach culture.
Yes.
But it should be, and it should be just like language,
Yeah.
and just like the meaning of a word is going to keep
Mhm.
changing in different contexts. A cultural practice or perspective or whatever is going to change in different contexts, and so like
Right.
we're
And so
learning contexts. Yeah,
the target then is the intercultural learning, the ability to observe, to learn from, to see how people are operating,
yeah,
and to make informed critical thinking kinds of decisions about how you respond to it. Like with language, we're not just teaching little bits of vocabulary and stacking them up together. We're teaching communication skills.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so those little bits are the things that we will be using for them, but those are the flexible parts
yeah,
instead of, yeah, the goal is
yeah,
communication, and
yeah.
communication includes that intercultural ability.
I have a kind of general strategy I tell my students if they ever ask, like, in this situation, should I shake a hand, or in this situation, should I bow? Like in this situation, should I? And I tell them that that's not a good way to think about it. You really
Watch what
should,
people are doing.
yeah, learn to observe, like learn to sit back, learn to say less, learn to watch, learn to listen. Um, those are your best ways to start out. And when you get into a specific community or a specific workplace or some like actual, I don't mean like a general category of a workplace, like all offices or all Chinese New Year celebrations or all, you know, really what I mean is like if like an actual one family that you might be hanging out with. Um, the intercultural learning I want to teach is that you learn to sit back and watch them first.
Hmm.
Like don't
Yeah.
inject and insert yourself constantly. Um,
Yeah.
I visited some students when I was in Beijing about maybe 10 years ago from UH, and some of them were saying, "Yeah, well, I'm really here to practice my language. I'm really here to practice my language." And I said, "It can be
Hmm.
antisocial to talk too much. Like, I know
Yes.
you want to practice your language, but it can really be like dominating the room if you're quote unquote practicing your language, which has other problems too, such as like topic management. And there's other things that happen when you're practicing language that are just nonsensical.
Right. Well,
And
you're not observing the way people are actually using language too. So
yeah,
you think you've been told this way to say it,
yeah,
and now you want to rehearse the speaking of it. And
yeah,
like, well, what is that doing to other people? Or are you, yeah, you have to
yeah,
at least observe their responses, right? To be a
yeah,
good communicator.
yeah. But also like the value of being in some actual situation and watching other people interact. Like there's so much like
Yeah.
context specific, location specific word usage, phrases, actions, social behaviors that are probably going to be surprising because of the
Mhm.
massive contextual dependence of all language usage and culture. So
Yeah.
it's to me, the big intercultural learning isn't the specifics, but it's the general sit back and
Hmm.
watch. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. I have a metaphor maybe for the sit back and watch thing.
Okay.
As you were talking about things, I thought of it. My husband traveled to Peru years back, many years ago, before we met even, but on a service trip, and he was there to help with a building project that was conducted locally. And so there were local folks from some of the tribes in the Amazon, and the tribal name I'm not going to get correct if I tried. But he was there working with those people side by side, along with a group of some other Americans, and they were doing this building project. And some of the local men who came that day to help first sat on the side and they were watching. And at first, my husband, fortunately for him, checks the thought, but said, like, oh, they're lazy. They're just sitting on the side.
Mm.
They're not coming in here and trying to do something. But what they were doing was observing what was happening, how it was operating. And then as they saw, oh, that beam, they need some help with that, they would run in and hold the beam. And like, so if you are such a good observer that you understand, here's the goals, I'm not going to get in their way. But when they need me, I am right there and I'm going to join in at the key time. Like that to me is like a really great picture of intercultural learning.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I understand this system. It's not really my system, but I can enter in and be a real participant.
Yeah. And it fits the what was the actual fifth C about community? It's like this, it's like the
Yeah.
one of the sub goals under community. It's called lifelong learning.
Yeah.
And to be a lifelong learner, like instead of just learning concrete cultural points from your classroom, beyond the classroom for the rest of your life, can you be a good learner? That simple thing of just learning to be good and just observe, just being a
Yeah.
good observer can help a lot. Um,
Yep.
I have a thing about, you mentioned earlier, the sort of by the way culture, like when we say like, oh, by the way, here's some extra cultural thing after we've learned language. Um, I've started going through a textbook that was left over in my classroom from a previous teacher, and it would have these little cultural texts toward the end of each
Yeah.
lesson.
That's a classic textbook technique.
It's like, hey, by the way, there's this now you can apply your language. No, the problem with them is that they end up using words that were not taught in the lesson. And I have a
Hmm.
kind of corpus perspective on that. I have a kind of research or language usage perspective on that. And it's that every actual situation, every actual context has words that will be distinctive to that context. So
Hmm.
if you're eating at an actual restaurant, you're going to use certain restaurant words that are only useful in a restaurant, or they're mainly only useful in a restaurant. I'm not going to say purely only, but words like pour. Can I pour you some more water?
Hmm.
Pour is not a common verb outside of table eating. Classroom is full of them. Can I take attendance? Are you tardy? Those are
Hmm.
just in a classroom that we need those words. But I would say that every context has its own special one. So when you have that little cultural reading, I think it goes against the goal of the lesson in the textbook, which is these are general words that you'd need for every context that are not specific and unique and odd and peculiar just to one context. However, the
Yeah.
cultural topic is going to need some words that are just for that cultural topic. And so, yeah, there ends up being vocab that just wasn't in the lesson. So I just skipped the whole thing. I just cut out a few of those. I don't want to, I want to respect copyright, but I'll take a little bit. So I took a couple of those cultural things. There's one about Chinese names. The Chinese surnames can be double or single surname. There's one about Chinese business etiquette. They're all pretty neat. There's some holiday ones. Um, but I lead with those. And so I'm not using
Hmm.
the textbook. I am kind of pilfering a tiny, tiny little, 1% of the textbook, less than 1%. Um, but I'm leading with those. And then sometimes they're based on actual stories. And so I'll go find the original news article and then we'll read like the one key sentence from the news article. It's a kind of narrow reading.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd rather lead with that and then build activities around the content of that article instead of saying, here's some random general use language that's built up through
Yeah.
a lot of disconnected activities. And then here's some culture at the end. It's like, no, 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 let's make the
Yeah.
culture at the beginning and central. And then we'll keep tying back to the information from that text. We'll have different
Right.
discussions about that text. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would argue that like that for the novice level learner again, you can still lead with that and maybe not all of those specific specialized terms. So you show the pictures of people at a special celebration and you talk about the aspects of it that you can talk about in the language, and you're letting them observe cultural things beyond that. Like you don't have to talk about every single thing in the target language yet. You don't need to just talk about it in English though either. Like you're introducing in a gradual way some of these cultural practices and themes by exposing them to actual pictures from the culture. This is where I think authentic resources are important. Like to be able to, it's not so much in the language use at the level of the fluent speaker yet when you're starting with beginners or intermediates, but you're showing them real life stuff from the culture through pictures and videos and
Yeah.
social media posts that people use, and little things like that can really help build up over time.
Yeah. And for total beginners, you can stick with the more general use words like general categories for things instead of the specific thing. For example,
Mhm.
instead of saying this is a cheap how, which is the specific name for a certain kind of garb.
Dress.
It's a dress,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of saying the specific word cheap how, you could just say you could point to it and say otada ifu, his or her
Hmm.
clothing. You could just use the word
Right.
clothing for a total beginner.
Yeah.
And you can stick to like instead of saying if you had some pictures of animals, you don't have to name the specific animals. You could as like a little one-off, but then if you want to get them more familiar with useful words that they can use a lot as in the beginning stages, beginning proficiency levels, you could just use the word animal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And they
just
can
keep it
see
general.
more than maybe the specific words that they can use yet, but that's appropriate with that kind of stage of
Yep.
language
You could
development.
say
So,
this animal is doing that. This animal is where. This animal is where. And you can
hmm.
point to it as you say it. You can keep the
Hmm.
language very general,
Yeah.
depending on the level of your students.
Yeah, and your goals in that thing. Maybe there's a reason why you want that really specialized vocabulary really early on for a specific thing. Your
Yeah.
kids are into it or something like that. Great, go for
Yeah.
it. But
And
but
and
then
yeah,
don't do
students,
don't do everything all at once.
yeah, you don't need to teach everything all at once. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I would say I do that with my daughter a lot is what I have at the front of my mind is can I get this idea to her in a way that she'll understand accurately enough as I intend to her for her to understand.
Yeah.
And so I specifically do things where it won't be even grammatical. Not necessarily. So learners in classrooms get way less input than human children do
Yeah.
at
In
home.
their
And
family.
and
Yeah.
and and families love watching kids make mistakes because they know it's going to
Hmm.
go away and they cherish
Yeah, it's
those
so
cute little
cute.
mistakes. It's so cute. And
Yeah,
it's
her
like, and
pat pat. Does she still have a pat pat instead of a backpack?
she doesn't say pack pack. We got to give her one. She hasn't used it yet. The pack pack. And so, yeah,
Yeah,
when you visited
it
us,
was
she
wonderful.
would
Yeah.
she would see the backpack and she would say pack pack, and we would say
Yeah,
back to her, yeah, pack pack, pack pack, and we never gave her like the correct input because adults know. I don't think we
she'll
think
get
of it
it.
in terms of input. We know that
No.
it'll get
No.
fixed over time by magic. We know that
Yes.
something's going to make it. Now, I as a
Yes.
you and I as researchers know that it's going to be just all the nonstop, many thousands of hours of input that is
Yeah.
going to end up correcting it because we see all children end up converging gradually on adult-like language. And so we
Right.
hold on to those errors because they're so cute.
Hmm.
In a classroom, I wouldn't advocate that teachers take the same mindset because the input is so limited. Even if you're providing lots of input, the classroom hours
Yes.
are tiny. And so, yeah, you got to use your classroom time more wisely. And I
Right.
do, yeah,
Right. And we don't have infants in the classroom typically as our students. They're older. And so just culturally, societally, if you use your society thing, like
yeah.
they're going to be judged differently than a 2-year-old would be.
Also
And
true.
so,
Also true. Yeah. So
a
the errors are
16-year
not
old
seen as cute. Yeah, when they're teenagers. Yeah.
not if some errors are
No.
not seen as cute.
No.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Some are just like they'll be off-putting or just or confusing
Sure.
to people.
Sure.
Occasionally they're kind of cute. I
Right.
said the word for let's see, wool thread instead of the word for adventure one
Mm.
time in a
Mm.
in a Chinese conversation with somebody because I got the tones wrong, but
Yeah.
apparently clearly did use tones, but definitely did the wrong ones. And
I
my
see.
friend just tittered about it because she was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, that's
No,
so
okay.
funny."
So it
Because,
can
but
be.
yeah, like, yeah, I get it. That's funny, but
Yeah.
that's not what I want to have happen when I'm in a more professional setting or it's what I'm with a stranger that doesn't
Yeah.
know me or like, yeah,
Yeah.
you don't want to be bound to that.
Yeah. So the coming round to the point of comparing with children is it in a classroom like we do want to use our time a little more usefully, stick to kind of target input. I kind of lost the thread here in my own mind now. I'm a little bit
Oh.
forgot exactly, but it was something about using general use words, I think, or like sticking to language that students can generally use to talk about culture. So when we see like cultural images, um, it's it's useful to start with general things. I think it's okay to have throwaway words where it is cheap how it is the specific word, but we
Mhm.
don't dwell on it because we want to get our students ready for the more general situations. And also as a communication strategy, if we show them a new picture, our goal would be that they can say something about it, ask questions about it, continue a conversation about it. Also, as a teacher, when I want to say, okay, you know, is this a fancy chi pao or not a fancy chi pao, and the students don't understand, I want the tool to be able to use other words to continue the conversation. So then I can say, okay, the clothing, is this fancy or not fancy clothing? So I have this general use word that would be useful across a lot of different other pictures that aren't so specific.
Because if you've got those general use words, you can ask the question about what's that specific thing called more easily than you can go the other way. If you have only specific words and don't have the tools for asking the question or the
Okay, so I remember I brought up the baby because my main goal is to be understood. I want her to understand me accurately. And in the classroom, I want to be understood when I'm interacting with my students. If they want to talk, I want them to be able to be understood too. But I'm leading with that. It's like, and so then I'm going to find what are other words that will be useful. And I brought up the accuracy thing because I'll say to Annie, I'll say, is this Annie's? I won't say, is this yours? I'll say, is this Annie's? Or I'll say, Daddy wants to go right now. That's not adult grammar in English. Adults don't refer to themselves as like daddy or usually say I. But I don't trust that she knows I and you very well. And I want to communicate as clearly as possible in the moment. And so what I'll end up saying is, does Annie want ice cream? Does Annie want to go? And then she'll say, Annie want go. And she'll repeat it back. And I go, good. We've accomplished the immediate task of communicating the idea that we're trying to communicate. Do you want to go? Yes, we've established it. And so with my own daughter, I'll use non-adult, non-target like grammar in order to communicate. And in my classroom, I won't do that so much, but I will kind of lead with the same idea of like, okay, is this a chi pao? And everyone's silent. And I'll say, okay, is this clothing? Yes. Okay. Now, yes, this clothing is chi pao. Like, oh, okay. Now we can lead into that. So those are some little language strategies that can be why it's useful to have general use and specific words when talking about cultural things.
I wanted to, before we run out of time, I see 2 minutes left, the models of intercultural learning, and you've referred to them too, like that kind of the honeymoon period, and then sometimes that crashes where now the new culture is all wrong and all my old stuff, that's the way I should do it. And like, and then there's the adaptation to the local setting that happens over time for people. If not everybody, it's not inevitable that you go through all of these stages, but I'm thinking it's Bennett is one of the theorists that did a model of intercultural development. Another is Byram, and they both have like diagrams, or I keep moving my hand like this because there's one it's not that it's like neat linear progression and you never go back or forward, or you don't have a little bit of this stage and then that stage, but you're moving from a more ethnocentric towards a more ethno-relativistic approach is kind of the general trajectory of both of those models. Dearborn, I want to say, is a third one. Deardorff is a third one. And we'll link. I can link to their prompt
it was
stuff
those
too.
First two, the cultural articles that I was reading a couple of years back, they were referring to both and saying both models are slightly different, but they can both be similarly useful to just how to think of like, what should learning look like when you're looking at your students growing in their intercultural competence? What should it look like? And these two models are helpful for that. It's going from general ethnocentrism, like my culture is the correct one, everyone else is weird, toward everything has a context, and let's just observe the practices and perspectives for those contexts. Relativistic thinking.
Right.
This has been fun.
And so I guess the key point is like teaching culture is not teaching facts, but helping develop our students' ability to perceive perspectives and engage in their own perspective thinking and taking.
And show respect.
Okay, so thanks for listening today. I'm Diane Neubauer, she, her.
And I'm Reed Riggs, he, him.
See you next time.
Thank you.